When war broke out in September 1939, the Atlantic Ocean became more than a vast stretch of water separating continents. It became a battlefield, silent, invisible, and unforgiving. Unlike the clashes of armies and tanks on land, this was a war fought largely out of sight, beneath the waves, where detection often came seconds too late, and survival depended on patience rather than firepower. Germany entered this struggle with a clear strategic problem. The Reich could not hope to defeat Britain quickly on land, and direct invasion was impossible without control of the sea. Britain's true vulnerability lay elsewhere, in its dependence on maritime supply lines. Food, fuel, raw materials, and troops all flowed across the Atlantic. If those lifelines could be severed, Britain could be strangled without a single soldier setting foot on its shores. The weapon chosen for this task was not the battleship, but the submarine. German U-boats were small, cramped, and fragile compared to surface warships. They lacked heavy armor and could not win open naval battles. But they possessed something far more dangerous: stealth. Moving unseen beneath the surface, they could strike without warning and vanish before defenders even knew they were under attack. Early in the war, Allied anti-submarine defenses were poorly coordinated and technologically limited. Vast stretches of the Atlantic were effectively unprotected. Convoys sailed with minimal escort. Detection equipment was primitive. For U-boat commanders, the ocean offered opportunity, a hunting ground measured not in kilometers, but in patience and timing. Life aboard a U-boat was harsh from the beginning. Crews lived packed into steel tubes, surrounded by fuel fumes, engine noise, and constant humidity. There was little privacy, limited fresh air, and no escape once submerged. Yet these conditions forged tight-knit crews, bound by discipline and mutual reliance. Every patrol carried the same unspoken understanding. Once the boat slipped beneath the surface, there would be no help if something went wrong. As the first months of the war passed, German submarines began to score alarming successes. Merchant ships vanished into the depths with little trace. Survivors were rare. Shipping losses mounted faster than Britain could replace them. To those watching from the surface, the Atlantic seemed vast and empty. But below, a silent war had begun, one that would decide the fate of nations long before the outcome was visible on any map. This was the opening act of the Battle of the Atlantic, and in its early phase, the hunters moved unseen. Germany's early submarine strategy was shaped by experience and necessity. During the First World War, U-boats had come close to forcing Britain out of the conflict, but had ultimately been defeated by convoys, escorts, and industrial scale. When the Second World War began, German naval planners were determined not to repeat the same mistakes, but they faced a critical limitation: numbers. At the outbreak of war, Germany possessed far fewer submarines than it needed to seriously disrupt Atlantic traffic. Individual U-boats hunting alone could sink ships, but they could not overwhelm well-defended convoys. To overcome this weakness, Admiral Karl Dönitz developed a radical approach, one that would turn coordination into a weapon. The concept became known as the Wolf Pack. Instead of attacking independently, U-boats would spread out across vast patrol lines, acting as scouts rather than hunters. When a convoy was detected, the shadowing submarine would report its position by radio. Other U-boats would then converge from different directions, gathering silently under cover of darkness. The attack itself was carefully timed. Rather than striking immediately, wolf packs waited for nightfall. Under darkness, U-boats surfaced, becoming faster and more maneuverable. From the convoy's perspective, the ocean suddenly filled with invisible predators. Torpedoes struck from multiple angles. Escorts struggled to respond. Confusion spread faster than orders could be given. This tactic exploited Allied weaknesses with brutal efficiency. Early radar was unreliable. Sonar coverage was limited. Escort commanders often faced multiple contacts without knowing which threat was real. While one U-boat drew attention, others slipped into firing positions. Losses mounted quickly. Communication was the backbone of this system. Radio transmissions carried risk. They could be intercepted, but the benefits outweighed the danger in the early years of the war. German command centers tracked convoys in near real time, directing submarines like chess pieces across the Atlantic. For merchant sailors, the experience was terrifying. Attacks came suddenly, often at night. Ships burned, broke apart, or vanished entirely. Rescue was uncertain. Survival depended on luck, weather, and how quickly escorts could drive attackers away. The wolf pack was not just a tactic. It was a philosophy, one that transformed scattered submarines into a coordinated hunting force. And for a time, it worked devastatingly well. For the men who crewed Germany's U-boats, the Battle of the Atlantic was not fought on open water, but inside a narrow steel cylinder barely large enough to stand upright. Life aboard a submarine was defined by confinement, routine, and constant tension, conditions that tested both body and mind long before the enemy appeared. A typical U-boat carried between 40 and 50 men. They slept wherever space allowed, between torpedoes, under pipes, beside engines. There were no private quarters. Bunks were shared in shifts. When one sailor finished his watch, another took his place. Personal belongings were reduced to the bare minimum. Once the boat left port, there was no escape from the presence of others. Air was a precious resource. While submerged, oxygen levels dropped steadily, mixed with diesel fumes, sweat, and the smell of unwashed bodies. Fresh water was rationed. Washing was rare. Food spoiled quickly. Bread grew mold within days. Fresh meals disappeared early in the patrol, replaced by canned rations and whatever could still be swallowed in the oppressive heat or cold. Silence was often a matter of survival. During enemy patrols, crews whispered or communicated by hand signals. A dropped tool or slammed hatch could give away the submarine's position. When depth charges exploded nearby, the entire hull shook violently. Lights flickered, instruments rattled. Every man listened for the sound that mattered most, the tearing of steel. Psychological pressure was relentless. A U-boat under attack could do nothing but dive deeper and wait. There was no fighting back, no running. Crews endured hours, sometimes days, of pursuit, listening as explosions marched closer or faded away. Many sailors later described this waiting as worse than combat itself. Yet despite these conditions, discipline held. U-boat crews were highly trained and intensely loyal to one another. Survival depended on coordination and trust. Every role mattered, from the commander making tactical decisions to the sailor adjusting valves deep in the engine room. For those who volunteered, there was a grim understanding from the start. U-boats offered prestige and danger in equal measure. Losses were expected. Return was never guaranteed. Inside these steel hulls, far below the waves, the war became intimate, claustrophobic, and unforgiving. And for the men who lived it, the Atlantic was not an ocean. It was a prison that moved. By 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic had entered a deadly new phase. Britain had survived the initial shock of submarine warfare, But the war was expanding, and with it, new vulnerabilities emerged. When the United States entered the conflict, German U-boat commanders saw opportunity on a scale they had never imagined. The American coastline was dangerously unprepared. Cities remained brightly lit at night, silhouetting merchant ships against the horizon. Convoy systems were poorly organized. Anti-submarine patrols were scattered and inexperienced. For German submarines, the eastern seaboard of the United States became a vast, exposed hunting ground. U-boat crews called this period the Second Happy Time. Ships sailed independently. Tankers burned within sight of shore. Wreckage washed onto beaches. Night after night, submarines attacked with minimal resistance, often surfacing openly to fire torpedoes at close range. In some cases, commanders reported sinking multiple ships in a single patrol. The psychological impact was enormous. Merchant sailors knew they were vulnerable, yet had little protection. Coastal communities watched fires burn offshore, unable to intervene. Insurance rates skyrocketed. Shipping schedules collapsed. For a brief but critical period, Germany appeared to be winning the war at sea. Success bred confidence and danger. U-boat commanders pushed deeper into Allied waters. Patrols grew longer. Boats operated farther from friendly bases, stretching supply lines and increasing risk. Meanwhile, Allied forces began to learn quickly from their mistakes. Radar improved. Air patrols expanded. Convoy systems were finally enforced along the American coast. What had once been an easy hunt began to tighten into a trap. The Second Happy Time did not last. But in those months, German U-boats inflicted catastrophic losses and came closer than ever to cutting the Atlantic lifeline entirely. It was the high tide of submarine warfare, and like all tides, it would soon begin to turn. By late 1942, the balance of power in the Atlantic began to shift. The devastating successes of the U-boats had forced the Allies to adapt, and this time, adaptation came faster and more decisively than Germany expected. The ocean was no longer an open hunting ground. It was becoming a monitored, defended battle space. The most important change was coordination. Convoy systems were expanded and enforced across the Atlantic. Merchant ships no longer sailed alone. Escorts became more numerous and better trained. Destroyers, corvettes, and frigates worked as unified hunting groups, sharing information and covering each other's blind spots. Technology accelerated the transformation. Radar improved dramatically, allowing ships and aircraft to detect submarines at greater distances and in poor weather. Sonar became more reliable. High-frequency direction finding, known as Huff-Duff, allowed Allied forces to locate U-boats by tracking their radio transmissions. The very communications that made wolf packs effective now betrayed them. Air power closed the last gaps. Long-range patrol aircraft extended coverage into previously unreachable mid-Atlantic zones. U-boats could no longer surface safely, even far from land. The ocean that had once protected them now exposed them. Depth-charge tactics evolved as well. Instead of random patterns, escorts used coordinated attacks, boxing submarines in and forcing them deeper until batteries ran low and air ran out. Survival increasingly depended on luck rather than skill. Losses mounted at an alarming rate. Entire crews vanished without trace. Patrols that once promised success now carried a high probability of death. Experienced commanders were killed faster than they could be replaced. Morale began to crack. The hunters were becoming the hunted. For the first time in the war, U-boat commanders understood a grim truth. The Atlantic was no longer theirs, and every patrol now began with the knowledge that return was no longer likely. As the Battle of the Atlantic entered its decisive phase, it was no longer tactics alone that determined survival. Technology, paired with industrial scale, began to close the ocean itself. What had once been vast and unknowable was turning transparent. Allied scientific advances reshaped anti-submarine warfare. Improved radar sets could detect a U-boat's periscope or conning tower even in heavy seas. Sonar operators became more skilled, able to track contacts through evasive maneuvers. New weapons, such as the Hedgehog and later the Squid, allowed escorts to attack submarines without losing sonar contact, a deadly advantage. Perhaps most decisive was air power. Long-range aircraft, like the Liberator, extended patrol coverage across the air gap, the last refuge where U-boats had once operated freely. Submarines could no longer surface safely to recharge batteries or ventilate the boat. Forced to remain submerged, their speed dropped, their endurance collapsed, and their vulnerability increased. At the same time, Allied shipyards transformed the strategic equation. Merchant ships were no longer rare or irreplaceable. Liberty and Victory ships were launched faster than U-boats could sink them. Even when submarines succeeded, their victories no longer altered the balance of supply. German countermeasures arrived too late. New snorkel systems allowed U-boats to run diesel engines while submerged, but they were unreliable and detectable. Advanced submarine designs promised higher underwater speed, but they never appeared in meaningful numbers before the war ended. By 1943, the mathematics of the war had turned brutal. For every ship sunk, Germany lost irreplaceable crews and submarines. Experience drained away, training shortened, survivability collapsed. The Atlantic had been conquered not by a single weapon, but by systems, technology, coordination, and production working together. Against this, courage and skill were no longer enough. The ocean was no longer a place to hide. As the Battle of the Atlantic turned against Germany, the true cost of submarine warfare became impossible to ignore. What had begun as a war of stealth and opportunity was now a war of attrition, and the U-boat arm was losing it. Losses reached catastrophic levels. Entire crews disappeared without survivors, leaving no stories, no graves, and no closure for families at home. By 1943, the survival rate of U-boat sailors had fallen dramatically. Many who set sail knew, statistically, that they were unlikely to return. Morale suffered, even as discipline remained. The psychological burden was immense. Crews endured long patrols with little chance of success, hunted relentlessly by escorts and aircraft. The Atlantic, once vast and protective, now felt claustrophobic and hostile. Every sonar ping, every aircraft engine overhead signaled danger. Rest was rare. Tension never lifted. Training standards declined under pressure. As experienced commanders were lost, replacements arrived with fewer patrols behind them and less tactical intuition. Mistakes multiplied. Coordination broke down. The edge that had once defined the U-boat force dulled quickly. Yet patrols continued. Orders did not change simply because the odds had worsened. Submarines were still sent to sea, tasked with disrupting convoys and delaying Allied operations, even when success was increasingly unlikely. For many crews, duty replaced hope. The human cost extended beyond the submarines themselves. Families waited months for news, often receiving only silence. Official notifications were brief, impersonal, and final. Entire communities, particularly in coastal regions, felt the loss acutely. By the later years of the war, the U-boat arm was no longer a decisive weapon. It had become a sacrificial force, one that absorbed losses in an effort to slow an enemy that could no longer be stopped. The hunt continued. But now, it was the hunters who were paying the price. As losses mounted and defeat at sea loomed, Germany searched desperately for a technological solution that could reverse the tide. If tactics and courage were no longer enough, perhaps innovation could restore the balance. New submarines, new weapons, and new concepts promised a return to dominance, at least on paper. The most ambitious answer was a new generation of submarines designed for underwater warfare rather than surface attack. Unlike earlier U-boats, which relied on surfacing to move and fight, these designs were intended to remain submerged for extended periods. Faster underwater speeds, streamlined hulls, and advanced batteries promised a fundamental shift in submarine combat. But these advances came too late. Production delays, Allied bombing, and shortages of materials slowed deployment. Crews were rushed through training, maintenance suffered. By the time the first of these new submarines reached operational status, the war situation had already deteriorated beyond recovery. Other countermeasures offered little relief. Improved torpedoes arrived after years of reliability problems. Acoustic decoys and radar warning devices provided occasional escapes, but could not overcome the overwhelming Allied advantage in detection and numbers. Each innovation addressed a symptom, not the underlying imbalance. Meanwhile, Allied pressure intensified. Submarine bases were bombed relentlessly. Transit routes became lethal gauntlets. Even reaching the open Atlantic was now dangerous. Many U-boats were destroyed before ever encountering an enemy convoy. For commanders at sea, the reality was clear. The tools had changed, but the environment had not. The Atlantic was now dominated by Allied aircraft, escorts, and intelligence. There was no space left for experimentation. Germany had entered the war with submarines suited to an earlier phase of naval combat. By the time truly modern designs emerged, the conditions that made them relevant were gone. Innovation alone could not undo years of attrition. The future of submarine warfare had arrived, but it arrived in a war that was already lost. By 1944 and early 1945, the German U-boat campaign had entered its final, most desperate phase. The Atlantic was no longer a contested ocean. It was firmly under Allied control. Yet submarines continued to leave port, slipping into the sea on patrols that few expected to succeed. These final missions bore little resemblance to the early years of the war. U-boats rarely encountered unprotected convoys. Instead, they faced layered defenses, radar-equipped escorts, constant air patrols, and intelligence systems that often knew their positions before they reached operational areas. Surprise, once the submarine's greatest weapon, was almost impossible to achieve. Crews understood the reality. Patrol reports spoke of caution, restraint, and long periods of evasion rather than attack. Many boats spent weeks submerged, avoiding detection, conserving batteries, and waiting for opportunities that never came. When contacts were made, they were fleeting and dangerous. Losses remained high. Some submarines vanished without ever reporting contact. Others were destroyed while transiting coastal waters or approaching bases already under surveillance. The act of simply reaching the Atlantic had become a gamble with slim odds. Despite this, discipline held. Orders were followed. Boats continued to deploy. For many sailors, these patrols were no longer about victory or even strategy. They were about duty, fulfilling an obligation to comrades, commanders, and a cause that was visibly collapsing. The Atlantic in these final months was quiet in a different way, not silent with opportunity, but silent with inevitability. The great convoy battles had faded. The decisive moments were over. What remained were isolated encounters, scattered losses, and the slow extinguishing of a once feared force. The last patrols did not change the course of the war, but they marked the end of an era. The moment when the wolves of the Atlantic slipped back into the depths, not as hunters, but as ghosts. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the Battle of the Atlantic concluded not with a single decisive engagement, but with exhaustion and collapse. Germany's U-boat arm, once the most feared weapon at sea, had been worn down by technology, industry, and relentless pressure. The numbers told a brutal story. Hundreds of submarines had been destroyed. Tens of thousands of sailors were dead. For many crews, the Atlantic became a grave without markers, their boats lost with all hands. No other branch of Germany's armed forces suffered such a high casualty rate. Surrender came quietly. Surviving U-boats surfaced, raised black flags, and transmitted surrender signals. Crews were ordered to scuttle vessels or hand them over intact. For men who had lived and fought beneath the sea for years, the transition was surreal. The war ended not in battle, but in silence. Post-war analysis made the outcome clear. The U-boat campaign failed not because submarines were ineffective, but because they were overwhelmed by systems they could not counter. Intelligence, radar, sonar, air power, and industrial production combined into a force greater than any individual weapon. The Atlantic had become a closed environment, hostile, transparent, and unforgiving. Stealth alone was no longer enough. Courage and skill could not overcome mathematics and manufacturing. Germany had come closer than any nation before to severing Britain's lifelines, but in the end, the Allies adapted faster, produced more, and coordinated better. The wolf packs were broken not by a single blow, but by constant pressure applied everywhere, all the time. Defeat beneath the waves marked the end of Germany's hopes at sea, and with it, the realization that modern war would no longer be decided by daring alone, but by systems that could learn, scale, and endure. When the submarines finally returned, or failed to return, the human cost of the Battle of the Atlantic became impossible to hide. Behind every tonnage figure and patrol report stood men whose lives had been shaped and often ended far from public view. For survivors, the end of the war brought little relief. Years spent in confined steel hulls left lasting physical and psychological scars. Many former U-boat sailors struggled with hearing loss, respiratory problems, and chronic stress. Nightmares of depth charges and flooding compartments followed them long after the ocean was gone from their lives. Families faced a different burden. Thousands never received bodies to bury, only brief notices stating that a boat was missing. Closure was rare. The sea offered no graves, no certainty, only absence. In coastal towns across Germany, the loss of entire crews left generational wounds. There was also silence. After 1945, the U-boat war was rarely spoken of openly. Defeat overshadowed service. Many veterans chose not to talk about their experiences, carrying memories privately rather than risk judgment or misunderstanding. Their war had been fought in darkness, and it ended the same way. Yet among those who served, bonds remained strong. Crewmen remembered one another not as heroes or villains, but as companions who endured something extreme together. Survival, when it came, felt arbitrary, a matter of timing, luck, and circumstance rather than skill alone. The Battle of the Atlantic was often described in terms of ships sunk and convoys saved. But for those who lived it, the war was measured differently. In patrols completed, friends lost, and the quiet knowledge that many never came back. Long after the fighting stopped, the human cost of the submarine war continued to surface. Slowly, painfully, and far from the waves where it had begun, the Battle of the Atlantic did not end with surrender alone. It left behind lessons that reshaped naval warfare for generations. What unfolded beneath the waves between 1939 and 1945 became a case study in how modern war adapts and how quickly advantages can disappear. At the start of the conflict, German U-boats demonstrated how a relatively small force, used intelligently, could threaten a global power. Stealth, coordination, and initiative allowed submarines to challenge surface fleets far larger than themselves. For a time, the balance of the war hinged on this asymmetry, but the Atlantic also revealed the limits of such advantages. Once the Allies unified command structures, shared intelligence, and integrated technology across air, sea, and industry, the submarine threat could be contained. No single invention defeated the U-boats. Instead, it was the accumulation of small improvements: radar, sonar, escort tactics, aircraft range, code breaking, production capacity that closed the gap. This shift marked a turning point in naval doctrine. Control of the sea was no longer determined solely by ships and crews, but by networks. Information flowed faster than submarines could move. Detection systems overlapped. Logistics became as decisive as firepower. The Atlantic became the first fully industrialized, system-driven naval battlefield. Post-war navies absorbed these lessons quickly. Submarines would remain vital, but never again as isolated hunters. They would become part of larger strategic frameworks, supported by intelligence, communications, and deterrence doctrines. The age of the lone wolf was over. The Battle of the Atlantic proved that modern war rewards those who can adapt continuously, not once, but again and again. It showed that innovation must be paired with scale and courage with coordination. Beneath the waves, the future of warfare had been written, not in a single decisive battle, but across years of relentless learning. With the guns silent and the convoys safe, the Battle of the Atlantic faded from daily headlines, but its meaning did not disappear. Unlike land campaigns marked by borders gained or lost, this war beneath the waves left behind no clear lines on a map. Its consequences were felt in what didn't happen. Britain did not starve, Allied armies crossed oceans, and global supply lines remained intact. For Germany, the failure of the U-boat campaign marked a strategic limit. No matter how daring the crews or innovative the tactics, submarines alone could not overcome an opponent with superior resources, technology, and coordination. The Atlantic exposed the gap between operational brilliance and strategic reality. For the Allies, survival at sea became a foundation of victory elsewhere. Every landing in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy depended on ships that crossed the Atlantic safely. Every tank, aircraft, and soldier arrived because the submarine threat had been contained. The quiet struggle at sea made loud victories on land possible. This imbalance shaped post-war thinking. Nations concluded that future wars would be decided less by singular weapons and more by systems that connected intelligence, industry, and operations. The Atlantic was proof that endurance and coordination could defeat surprise and audacity over time. The U-boat war also challenged how history remembers conflict. Its battles were rarely seen, its heroes often unknown, its dead unrecovered. Yet its outcome influenced the fate of continents. It was a reminder that the most decisive struggles are not always the most visible. Victory and defeat in the Atlantic were not moments. They were processes. Measured in months of adaptation, thousands of small decisions, and countless lives lived in silence beneath the waves. After 1945, the German U-boats did not simply vanish with the end of the war. They became objects of study, caution, and reflection. Allied navies examined captured submarines in detail, dissecting their design, tactics, and operational history. The wolves of the Atlantic were no longer enemies. They were lessons. Many surviving U-boats were scuttled, broken up, or sunk during post-war tests. Others were distributed among Allied powers for evaluation. Their technology influenced future submarine development, but their wartime role was not repeated in the same form. The conditions that had once allowed wolf packs to thrive no longer existed. Former U-boat commanders and sailors returned to civilian life in a defeated nation. For years, their experiences remained largely absent from public memory. Germany's post-war narrative focused on reconstruction, responsibility, and distance from the war. The silent service stayed silent. Historians gradually reframed the story. The U-boat campaign was no longer seen simply as a tale of aggression or defeat, but as a case study in modern warfare, how innovation can create temporary advantage and how adaptation can erase it. The submarines were deadly, but not decisive, effective, but ultimately unsustainable. In museums and memorials, U-boats came to represent something different from what they once had at sea. They symbolized endurance under extreme conditions, the dangers of technological overconfidence, and the human cost of strategic failure. Steel hulls that once carried fear now carried memory. The wolves had shaped the war, but they had not decided it. Their legacy was not dominance, but warning. History did not remember them for victory. It remembered them for what they revealed about the limits of power beneath the waves. The Battle of the Atlantic ended without parades or clear moments of triumph. There was no single surrender that marked its conclusion, no battlefield where victory could be photographed. Instead, it faded quietly, as wars at sea often do, leaving behind consequences far greater than its visibility ever suggested. German U-boats did not lose because they lacked courage, innovation, or discipline. They lost because modern war evolved faster than they could adapt. What began as a contest of stealth and initiative became a struggle defined by systems, intelligence networks, industrial production, air power, and coordination on a scale no individual weapon could overcome. For the men who served beneath the waves, the war was intensely personal. It was measured in hours of silence, moments of terror, and bonds formed under conditions few outsiders could imagine. Many never returned. Many who did carried the war with them for the rest of their lives. Their experiences remained largely unseen, overshadowed by louder victories and defeats elsewhere. Strategically, the Atlantic decided the war's direction long before it decided its outcome. Britain survived because supply lines held. The Allies prevailed because oceans could be crossed safely. Every major campaign in Europe rested on the result of this hidden struggle. History often remembers tanks, armies, and decisive land battles. But beneath them all ran a quieter conflict, one that determined whether nations could fight at all. The Battle of the Atlantic was not about territory gained or lost. It was about endurance, adaptation, and the ability to sustain war over time. The wolves of the Atlantic once hunted in darkness, unseen and feared. In the end, they were overcome not by a single enemy, but by a world that learned how to find them. Their legacy is not one of conquest, but of warning. In modern war, silence is powerful, but systems are stronger. And beneath the waves, history made its choice.